So, in the interest of appealing to whatever shared cultural unity might still exist between Canada and the US on a regional level, even after the Trump administration has basically shit all over that, I want to look at what is basically, in my opinion, a kind of cross border cultural region in a broad sense of North America, which is the North American Northeast, for lack of a better term. Now, people often talk about a cross border identity regarding the Pacific Northwest, but I don't really hear as much about it regarding the Northeast. And I actually think there is such a thing, having lived in Southern Ontario my entire life. And I just think people don't really talk about it that much. Maybe, to some people it's like, yeah, fish doesn't see water. But I actually do think there are certain similarities that cover the broad northeast region of Canada and the United States. And I kind of want to talk about how this region would be defined geographically, and B, what the similarities are. So to define the North American Northeast, I think. So yeah, when looking at the geography of the North American Northeast, I think basically the core of the region, the places that I would say are definitively included. Now I'm talking Northeast in the broad sense because I know in the U.S. they often just use the word Northeast to mean the northern original colony states, but I'm actually talking in a much broader sense. So I would say that the core of the Northeast would be all the New England states, so Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. I'd also include New York and New Jersey. I would include Pennsylvania, and I would also include Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, definitely. In Canada, I would include Ontario, Quebec, and all the Maritimes, so New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PI, and Newfoundland and Labrador. Now, in terms of the states, I would also include, but might be a bit more peripheral, Maryland and Delaware. I would include all or most. I'd include DC. And did I mention Indiana? Did I say Indiana? Yeah, Indiana. So all the Great Lakes, Eastern Midwest states, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio. And then, all the other Northeast ones I mentioned. So those are the ones I would include for sure. And I would also include a minority of several other states. So small regions of Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Kentucky, and Virginia, and West Virginia. I would include not a majority of any of those states, but small parts. I will make a map of them that I will link to of what I'm kind of talking about. But yeah, that's kind of what I would define as the North American Northeast. So the parts I'd include those states, to be honest, I've never been to Minneapolis. I'm not sure if it would be included or not, but if any of Minnesota would be included, it would be Minneapolis, St. Paul, and maybe some of the surrounding area. Iowa, there are some cities on the border with Illinois that may or may not be included. I am not sure. I've only been there very briefly and didn't get too much of an impression one way or another. Missouri, St. Louis could debatably be included. Kentucky, I would say the suburbs of Cincinnati on the Kentucky side. I would probably not say Louisville. I would say Louisville. I've never been there. From what I gather, it just feels more southern overall. West Virginia, I would say the two panhandles, the northern and eastern panhandle respectively, because that's where it starts feeling less southern. And in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, it's very close to Washington, D.C. So you even get commuters to the D.C. area from there. And plus Harper's Ferry, the architecture there looks more northeastern than southern, that's for sure. And plus even I don't know, like that map of the South. I'll link to it. There's someone on Reddit who made a map of what they consider the South culturally, and it kind of corresponds to this in terms of what is not included in the Northeast. So I'll link to that as well. Like they use different factors. I think they use like religio, like what are they Southern Baptist? Do they define in a plurality as American or Black in their ethnicity? Either of those two groups, American so-called ethnicity. I forget what the other ones were. It might have been the accent. I'm not sure how they measured that. I forget exactly what it was, but I'll link to it in the description, this map. But yeah, so those two parts of West Virginia, as far as Virginia itself is concerned, definitely the suburbs of DC, maybe some nearby areas of Northern Virginia. Probably not Richmond or Virginia Beach area. I would say those are probably more southern overall. Even if Richmond architecturally has some similarities with the Northeast, but then so do other historical architecture of some other northern southern cities. But yeah, no, I would say probably not Richmond or Virginia Beach overall, although they might be in a bit of a gray area. But yeah, overall, so the Northeast is, in the broad sense, the North American Northeast includes those states and those provinces, and then some regions of those other states, which would be more southern or western. Or not, if not Western, Great Plains. Like, I think essentially what the Northeast is defined by partly. I'm going to get into what traits make it up. Like, basically not Southern and not Western. And when I say Western, I mean even in the broad sense. Like, they're not central. They're not like Great Plains states. They're more like, they could be Midwest, but they're Eastern Midwest. They're more like Great Lakes. Like, if you look at the subregions of the North American Northeast, it would include like Upper Appalachia. It would include the Boswash Corridor, what is generally defined more specifically as the Northeast in an American sense. So it would include New England, Upper Appalachia, the Great Lakes region, so kind of like the Eastern Midwest. And in Canada, it would include Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. So what are the common traits that define the North American Northeast? Well, one of the biggest is climate, weather, and geography. When you look at a map of forests in North America, this region, especially the more populated parts of this region, are disproportionately dominated by deciduous forests. So that means trees with leaves as opposed to needles. And I think that's actually a big defining feature just of the landscape, the preponderance of deciduous trees. Now, obviously, that's not true for this entire region, because if you go further north, you get Canadian Shield, which is more of a mix of deciduous and coniferous. But the more populated parts, both Canadian and American, of this region are predominantly deciduous. And this contrasts to other regions, because you go further north, it's primarily coniferous. But if you go further south, it's also primarily coniferous. And even if you go further west, well, you first get like no trees because you get the Great Plains, but then you go further west than that, you get the Rocky Mountains, and that's where it becomes predominantly coniferous again. So it's really like an area of predominantly deciduous vegetation surrounded by areas of predominantly coniferous vegetation. There's actually a map of this I found online that I can link to in the description also. And yeah, obviously on the east side, it's surrounded by, the Atlantic Ocean. So yeah, on three sides, surrounded by coniferous, or in the case of the West, eventually, if you go far enough, coniferous. So that's one trait. And also just having a temperate climate, like a climate where obviously it varies. Like the more southern parts are warmer, the more northern parts are colder, obviously. But as a whole, the entire region could be categorized as temperate, with the exception of like the really northern parts of Ontario and Quebec. And to be honest, those are technically, I wouldn't even say those are really part of the region. It's just they technically are because they're part of these provinces. But northern Quebec really has more in common with like Nunavut or Northwest Territories than it has with southern Quebec or with the rest of this region. Same northern Ontario also, like the really, really far northern parts, like north of, like way further north than like Thunder Bay or Timmins, when you get into like like the really, really northern parts of Ontario. Again, very different. Very different. It's not really part of this region per se. It just happens to be technically part of the same province. Like you get a very different vibe when you get into these extremely remote northern areas. Like I'm talking like further north, significantly further north than Highway 11 in Ontario. Like as you get to the really northern parts, it gets just very different. I haven't been there, but like I've looked at it on Google Maps, obviously, and it's just extremely remote up there. Very different climate, very different geography. But when you get into the more populated parts, as I'm saying, there are commonalities in the Northeast because all of it is more temperate. Temperate to the extent, warm enough to have a real summer, cold enough to have a real winter. Cold enough to have some snow. Like even in the warmest parts, like Washington, D.C., there's still some snow and it still can get cold. It's not like in Florida where it'll only get snow like once in a blue moon. Like, so yeah, I mean, basically that's a common feature of the Northeast. Like I think climate, like being temperate, having four distinct seasons. Obviously there's a lot of variation, like from like the warmest being like Washington, D.C., and then the coldest of like the populated parts of this region maybe being like around Saguenay in Quebec or around like Thunder Bay in Northern Ontario. But even still, when you look at the most cold parts and the most warm parts, all of this region still has four seasons. It's still temperate. So yeah, I mean, I think that's an important distinction. Like it's not subtropical, it's not Arctic, it's temperate. Even if it hits like the different extremes of temperate, it's still within the temperate zone, all of it. So I think that's important, like the geography of it. Also the fact that in the more populated parts, there aren't that many like large mountains. Like there's smaller mountains like the Appalachians, but there's nothing massive like the Rockies or the Sierra Nevadas or anything like that. Like there's a few. There's actually, I rephrase, there's a few. There's a very few number of like large mountains in New Hampshire, Maine, and sort of Newfoundland, I guess. But they're not, again, they're kind of isolated and there's not that many of them. It's not like any huge mountain ranges of like massive stony rocky peaks like in the Rocky Mountains or the Pacific ranges. Again, obviously as you get further north into the less populated parts like Labrador, but that's not what I'm really talking about here. Like Labrador is only really part of this region by like technicality, by being part of the same province. In all honesty, it's not really like the true shared identity of this region is in the more populated regions. So that's one thing. Another thing is there are actually certain demographic commonalities, at least historically, and this is the sad thing. When talking about anything to do with human geography, it's getting harder and harder to talk about places in this context because immigration and multiculturalism are increasingly just making everything a hodgepodge of nothing and everything feeling everywhere feeling the same, like everything everywhere all at once, kind of like everything feels the same everywhere. Because there's just this random mix of different ethnic groups and there's nothing that dominates. But the thing is, if you go back even a few decades, there is definitely somewhat of a shared demographic makeup in this region in the sense that like there's fewer black people than in the South. There's fewer native people than in the West, and also fewer Hispanics than in the West. So it's kind of perhaps, at least historically, a more predominantly white region. Not as much today. And I mean, obviously, yes, there's been a black presence to some extent in some of the Boswash corridor for many decades, even perhaps, yeah, no, not just perhaps, like for over a century, well over a century, for multiple centuries in the DC area and Maryland and Delaware and such, which is why I say that area is partly like a bit peripheral to the region, but still, I would say technically in it. So yes, there has been a long-standing black population in that specific part of the Boswash corridor, but nonetheless, I think as a whole, this region has been historically like one of the whitest parts of North America up until recently. That said, I think there's also certain commonalities in terms of the types of white people who are overrepresented in this area. Like there's a lot of, I would say, Southern and Eastern European immigrant groups are disproportionately overrepresented in this area. Poles, Italians, Portuguese, Greeks, Russians. I think some of the like Balkan peoples, like Albanians and Serbians. A lot of different, like either Southern or Eastern European nationalities. The main exceptions there, though, would be like I know there's a lot of Czechs in Texas. All my Czechs live in Texas. There's also a lot of Spaniards by way of Latin America in like Florida and the Southwest and again Texas. So, but aside from that, I would say largely speaking, there's for the most part, Southern and Eastern Europeans would be more highly represented in this region, and especially in not just in the major cities actually, but even in the surrounding areas, compared to other parts of North America. Like a lot of the so-called Ellis Island Americans, and their equivalents in Canada. And that would be true for Jews also, frankly. They came in with a lot of these groups also. So yes, Jews would be overrepresented in this region, as well as in Florida, but in this region too. And like it or not, it has been a defining characteristic of the major cities in the region, like having a higher Jewish population, as well as the aforementioned other groups that I mentioned. The white groups plus the Jews who are considered by some to be white. I do not. But yes, that's a separate issue altogether. Now, in terms of people of French ancestry, it's interesting. French ancestry is overrepresented in this region compared to most of North America, but there's a major exception being Louisiana, because they also have a major French ancestral population with the Cajun and Creole backgrounds. So, yeah, they'd be the big exception there. But overall, yeah, French would also be overrepresented in this region. They're kind of, as I've said many times, like the French kind of straddle the gap between Northern and Southern Europe. So, yeah, they're sort of included there too. So, yeah, that would be one characteristic demographically. I would say that this distinction also manifests itself in the food culture of the area, because we get a lot of unique types of pizza, for instance, more so than other parts of North America. And I think a lot of that has to do with the higher Italian population. Like Chicago-style pizza, Detroit-style pizza. There's even Windsor-style pizza. It's funny how there's a Windsor-style pizza, but not a Toronto-style pizza in Canada. In Ontario. Allegedly, there's such a thing as Montreal-style pizza. I've never had it. I've looked at pictures, and I'm like, this doesn't look that distinct, really. But apparently there is. I don't know. There's obviously New York-style pizza. There's even something called New Haven style pizza from New Haven, Connecticut. I've never had that. I don't know how distinct it really is. There's also, like, apparently in addition to regular Chicago deep dish pizza, there's also Chicago tavern style pizza, which I've had pizza like that, but not in Chicago. I don't know if it would technically count. And then, I don't know, like what you would call like generic North American style pizza, if you know what I mean. Like, I would guess that probably originated in the Northeast also, I would guess. I don't know. I actually don't know. That's a very interesting question. Like, where did generic North American style pizza originate? Like the type that you would get at, say, like Domino's or Pizza or whatever, or at a local chain or a local restaurant that provides that type of pizza. It's an interesting question. Like, because it's not exactly the same as like New York style pizza, for instance, even though it's a similar shape, because New York style pizza is a lot more like thin crust. So I don't know, that's a very interesting question. I actually don't know. But I would guess probably within this region, the North American Northeast somewhere. Other food too, like there's a greater preponderance of Greek food in this area. There's things like the doner, which is like a variation of Greek food that originated in Nova Scotia, like a wrap that is kind of like a gyro or a kebab, but I think it's inspired by Greek food, and I think it was Greek immigrants in Nova Scotia, or maybe it might have been Middle Eastern Christian immigrants, I'm not entirely sure, who created the doner. If you've never eaten a doner, seriously try one. They're delicious, if you can get one. I don't think they sell them at many places outside of Canada. And even in Canada, it's like getting an authentic doner, there's not too many places, but there's some, and they're really good. It's kind of like, yeah, like a kebab or a gyro or whatever, but with like a sweet sauce. And onions and tomatoes, and it's really good. It's honestly really fucking good. Yeah, they talk about them in Trailer Park Boys a lot because they are from Nova Scotia after all. But yeah, that would be a thing. Like these immigrant foods, like from like different European immigrant nationalities. Even like some of the Jewish like deli sandwiches and stuff. I don't know if they originated in North America or in Europe, but there'd be more of a preponderance of that kind of food. Like Montreal smoked meat sandwich obviously originated in Montreal. But yeah, there's a lot of unique food that I think does owe itself to this background of immigrants coming from various parts of Europe, specifically like Southern and Eastern Europe. And I think that has shaped a lot of the cuisine of the region. But moving on, I think there's more similarities. I think I haven't even gotten to like some of the biggest ones because I think another big commonality of this region is sort of some of the historic architecture. Like I think if you go to, unfortunately, like a lot of the historic architecture in this region, as with the rest of North America, has been destroyed, mostly in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s because of car centrism and car centric urban planning, as well as white flight and the hollowing out of the inner cities, all the stupidity that occurred in those decades. Those decades that I have no nostalgia for, aside from some of the music and a few movies, but urban planning wise, dog shit decades. But my point is, what remains of it, there is definitely commonalities. Like there's a lot of like red brick historic architecture. There's a lot of similar styles, like colonial style, Victorian style, like a lot of like historic like brick architecture, like red brick and other similar colored bricks. You see that in a lot of the major cities, whether it be like St. Louis, Chicago, Toronto, Montreal, Philadelphia, Boston, DC, New York, Baltimore, Ottawa, like Detroit, like a lot of similarities in that regard. And yeah, there's a few cities in the northern south that I think have kind of similar historic architecture too, like say Nashville and Richmond, like whatever's left of it there. But the thing is, or Louisville for instance, and oh yeah, also Cincinnati and Columbus, not within the south but like within the northeast, do have some of this type of architecture too. So, I mean, there's a bit of overlap with some of the northern parts of the South, but nonetheless, I would say it's not the only defining characteristic. So that's why I wouldn't use like like historic architecture as the sole determinant of whether a certain area is part of this greater region. So I'd say that's one too. Like similar historic architectural styles. Although Quebec a little bit different, but they still do have some of the like historic red brick, like early 20th century, late 19th century architecture in Montreal, in Quebec City. Not in the very oldest parts of the city, but in the areas surrounding that are still historic, but not as old as like the really old, really touristy part of the old town. So like, yeah, there's some similarities in that. I would say there's similarities in the fact that like walkable, dense cities, like large cities with subways, with mass transit, with commuter rail, are like far more overrepresented in this part of North America compared to other parts of North America. Like the only other part of North America that really has these types of cities to the same extent is like the very, very West Coast. Like you'd have Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, and San Diego. But like by and large, I'd say in the North American Northeast, we have the most of these types of cities. Like there's like Chicago, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Quebec City. I mean Quebec City, okay, not as big, and it doesn't have rail transit like yet. I mean with intra-city rail. But you'd also have like yeah, New York, Boston, and also all the Jersey, like all the suburbs of New York that aren't really suburbs, but more like other cities like in New Jersey and Long Island. Also, yeah, DC, Philadelphia, even Baltimore, you could count. Yeah, there's a lot of this sort of thing, like denser more historic by North American standards and with more mass transit, more walkable. Again, by North American standards, this region would be the number one for that in North America. And I repeat myself, by North American standards. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a commonality. Another commonality, now Quebec is obviously the major exception to this, but accent, because they don't even speak the same language as us as their mother tongue. They speak French. But other than Quebec, the whole region, there are some accent similarities, especially now that like some of these like northeastern accents are starting to become less prominent. Like you even see this in The Sopranos with how like Tony and Carmela have a thick Jersey accent, but then AJ and Meadow do not. And I would say in my experiences in the region, that is very accurate. I remember when I went to New England in 2002 with my family, I heard New England accents everywhere. But then the next time I went to New England, which was in, well, technically we went again in 2004, but next time, but way later, the next time after that was it 2004? Ah, fuck it, I don't remember. But anyway, my point is, when the next time, like many years later after then, when I went to New England with my dad was in 2018, went to Boston and some of the surrounding areas, did not hear the New England accent nearly as much then. And it's the same is true for the New York accent when I went in 2002 versus 2015. Like, yeah, if I compare Boston 2002 versus 2018 or New York City 2002 versus 2015, like that's when I went to both these cities, it was like night and day, the amount that I heard the accent. So it's like, it is diminishing quite a lot. The Mayor Quimby accent, like the JFK accent, Cuba, they have the missiles in Cuba, like that kind of accent, like, oh, the fucking New Jersey, New York accent. Get the fuck back to New Jersey. Like, you know, that accent, like, honestly, that accent is diminishing quite a bit too, or any variation thereof. I don't know if the Jewish accent is diminishing, like, oh, I Gewalt, it's like another show. Like, I don't know if that accent is diminishing among the Jews also. And I mean, some people, even who are not Jewish, kind of have that accent. I mean, I could name one person, but I'm not gonna. I'm just saying, yeah, like, that accent, I don't know if it's diminishing. But it probably is. I would guess like all the regional accents in that area are diminishing. So what I'm saying is, the area distinguishes itself from the South by not having a Southern accent and by largely being dominated, like the entire Northeast region, by like kind of increasingly generic North American English. And I guess you could say the same for most of the West also. So this would be more of a distinction from the South rather than from the West. But yeah, as I said, the region, it's not just defined by what it is, it's defined by what it's not. So it also has to be looked at through this context, like it's not Southern and it's not Western. And it's not really central, although parts of it are sort of central. Like Illinois, I mean, it's technically Central Time. Wisconsin, like they're sort of heartland states, but sort of not, you know? So they're like sort of could be considered central US. But at the same time, in the broad sense of the word, I'd say they're Eastern. Like, they're Eastern and they're Central, in a way. Like, they're kind of in an overlap between the two. Just like how, say, you could say Maryland is kind of Northern and Southern. So, like, it can include states that are in a bit of a gray area or parts of states that are in a bit of a gray area. And I would say it may not include all, like, some parts of, like, really downstate Illinois, like Cairo or whatever, from what I've heard, are very, like, Southern. Or even some of the really southern parts of like Indiana or Ohio. What I find interesting is like in the distinction between North and South, I find when you have areas that are in a gray area between the North and the South in the US, if it's urban, it tends to gravitate more toward Northern. If it's rural, it tends to gravitate more towards Southern. Regardless of which state it's in, I find that tends to be the case. Because at least from that map that I've looked at of like what areas count as Southern according to these various metrics, and also from going to these places, like I've spent some time in these regions, like around the area near Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia, for instance, and in the West Virginia Eastern Panhandle. Like I have some familiarity with these regions personally, and I would say, yeah, that's kind of the vibe I get. Like the more rural it is, the more Southern it is, the more urban it is, the more Northern it is. Like regardless of the specific geography of how far north or south he is, like in that specific gray area, like Northern Virginia, um, Eastern West Virginia, the Panhandle, etc. So I think in my case, like some people will tell me, oh, there's no such thing as the greater Northeast. You're making this up because you're from Southern Ontario and because you're at the very center of this and you want to see there as being some commonality that doesn't really exist. And it's like, fair enough. Maybe my perspective is clouded from my personal experience because Southern Ontario is very much at the center of this. And that's why, for instance, I see commonalities in like the Great Lakes region of the US and also the Northeast region of the US, like the Boswash corridor, and also like Atlantic Canada and Quebec and Ontario, because it's like these regions to me are like they're all within a day's drive or day's train ride or whatever, maybe. I don't know, I've never taken intercity rail in this region, but my point is, yeah, maybe it is colored somewhat by my own experience being at the center of this region, seeing commonalities, but I think nonetheless, these commonalities do exist. And I think living in kind of the center of this region has really driven it home to me that I can see these commonalities and I see there as being kind of a broader Northeastern vibe. Like there is a certain vibe, like architecturally, geographically, topographically, yeah, in terms of like vegetation, even the animals. I'm sure there's some similarities, like which species of animals live in the region. I'm not an expert on that, but I'm sure there are. Yeah, I mean, and as I said, food, ethno-linguistic traits, like obviously Quebec's the major exception, but but even Quebec still has commonalities with the rest of the region, despite being a major outlier for speaking French, as well as obviously certain parts of New Brunswick and even a few really small parts of Ontario. But yeah, I mean, overall, I do think there's a common Northeastern identity. And I hope that the growing animosity between Canada and the US as of late doesn't destroy that sense completely. It's ironic because we're opening the Gordie Howe Bridge between Windsor and Detroit amidst all this crap going on lately. And it's kind of ironic because this bridge was supposed to be a symbol of friendship between Canada and the US, and it's in this specific region. And now it's like opening in a very different context than, you know, when it was being initially proposed and constructed. But yeah, there's definitely some irony to that. This long-awaited project opening at a time when Canada-U.S. relations are at their lowest they've been in decades, maybe centuries. Honestly, yeah, but my point is, I do hope that this regional identity on some level can still persevere, because like I notice similarities. Like when I'm in the US and in other parts of Canada in this region, I notice similarities that still make me feel like I'm sort of still at home in some ways. Like I remember driving back from the Southwest US, as soon as I started reaching like Western Illinois, it started looking a lot more like home, like in terms of the weather, in terms of the trees, in terms of just even the way the buildings look, like even the more modern buildings and stuff, like the suburban houses, even it started looking more like home. And it's like, I do think there's some common identity to the north, whatever you'd call it, the greater Northeast, the North American Northeast, the Northeastern quadrant of Canada and the US, whatever you want to call it. Like, I think there is a common identity to the region. So yeah, I guess that's all I've got to say about that right now. But I hope you all have found this fascinating. So, actually, it's been like a week or so now since I made this video, and I wanted to add a few things. Because there's a few crucial points I think I still need to go over here. Okay, it's funny because I mentioned the Gordie Howe Bridge, the bridge connecting Windsor and Detroit, and now Trump is actually trying to get in the way of that, trying to block it from being opened because of some complete made-up bullshit where he thinks that Americans are being disadvantaged here, when in reality it's actually the opposite. Canada disproportionately footed the bill. So Yeah, this does go to show the irony of the whole situation, which I was already talking about in this video. Um, but not only that, there's a few other points I want to make about what connects this region together, the greater North American Northeast. Um, Another aspect that I think is very crucial is, to some extent, the more, you could say, left liberal politics of the region, and especially just like not being as individualistic or as libertarian as the other parts of the continent, like compared to places both further south and further west. Now, obviously, again, there's the exception of the left coast, the west coast, the very west coast. But as I've said, like, this is something that is somewhat of a commonality in the greater Northeast, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily the only region like this. It just means, well, there's two regions really that are not geographically connected to one another, with the big, more conservative slash libertarian slash individualistic region in between. But yes, that is a commonality, although some parts of the greater Northeast are less so than others. Like, obviously, there's always the urban rural divide, where the cities tend to be more left liberal and the rural areas tend to be more libertarian slash conservative. Although, again, it varies, because there are some regions like rural Vermont that are still quite left leaning. But overall, yes. And also on a regional level, like, I would say Ohio and Indiana are definitely the most right-leaning parts of this region. And I mean, you could debate to some extent if the more southern parts of Indiana and Ohio truly are part of this region or not. I mean, I would say most of these states generally are, because they meet most of the criteria, but I would say they fit in a bit less than most other states and provinces in the region, in the sense that, like, yes, they are more conservative. They're more also, like, very agricultural. So, like, they do have some similarities to, like, the Great Plains as opposed to, like, the Northeast. So they're in a bit of a gray area, but nonetheless, like, Chicago is very much part of the greater Northeast. So I do think, like, the Midwestern states shouldn't be fully disqualified, because, like, not just Chicago, but say like Madison, Wisconsin. Also, I've been to Madison, Wisconsin, several times actually. I used to have family there, so they don't live there anymore. But yeah, I do have familiarity with there, and that whole region, I would say, feels the most like part of this region, like out of the Midwest, like Chicago and Madison, and maybe some of the surrounding area, because it does have a more liberal vibe. And I do think there is some, like, even someone like me, for instance, like, I consider myself like third positionist. So it's like I do have some left liberal elements to my overall philosophy. So, like, obviously, I'm very different from the left on issues like race and gender and sexuality. But nonetheless, I think there is part of that regional identity in my political framework, in the sense that, like, I'm less hyper individualistic, I'm less libertarian compared to many other North Americans in other parts of the continent, like in the American South, in the American Inland West, in the Great Plains, and even in provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan. So, yeah, I mean, I would say that's definitely a factor in the regional identity, being more liberal left, less hyper individualistic, less hyper libertarian compared to other parts of North America. Kind of retaining that, like, one foot in Europe kind of political culture, you know, like, sort of like a little bit like one foot on the other side of the Atlantic, kind of, in how our political culture is compared to other parts of North America. Like, we'd still be far more individualistic and libertarian than, like, anywhere in Europe, but less so than the rest of the continent, with the exception of the very, very West Coast. And I emphasize the very, very West Coast, because you do not have to go that far inland before you get to, like, the more conservative libertarian, like, inland West, where the cowboy culture, like, both literally and not in such a literal sense, the cowboy culture tends to dominate more, like the rugged individualism. Like you really don't have to go that far inland before it goes from very left to like very individualistic, conservative, libertarian. Like it goes pretty quick. Whereas in the Northeast, on the other hand, it's the more liberal left kind of political culture. I'd say it's not just a thin geographic strip. It goes a lot more inland. Like I would say the main vectors of it are the major cities, both along the Boswash corridor and also the Windsor to Quebec City corridor, which could also extend even to Chicago in the United States. So it would be like the Chicago to Quebec City corridor. But even some of the in-between cities are like fairly reliably left voting. Like if you look at voting patterns, like say Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Albany, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, like maybe not the entire metropolitan areas, but definitely like the county that forms the that includes the inner city. Like these cities are fairly reliably left voting, at least in federal elections. So yeah, I would say that's part of it, the general political culture of the region. Another defining feature of the greater Northeast is that a lot of the best museums, especially art museums, but other types of museums also in North America are in this region. Like Chicago, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, DC, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, all have some of the best museums in North America. Art museums and otherwise. Even like Detroit and Cleveland have pretty good art museums. So I'd say that is one defining feature of this region, like more so than other parts of North America. Like, yeah, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles is really good, but I would say overall, the best museums in the continent are disproportionately in the Northeast region. Like mostly art museums, but I'm also talking about like natural history museums, like say, or like history / natural history. Like you got some of those in Washington, D.C., New York, Ottawa, Toronto, Chicago. So yeah, definitely a lot of the best museums on the continent. Another feature is when you look at, I've talked about the architecture, but one thing I'd also like to mention specifically is like, in terms of some of the historic mansions, like there's definitely certain predominating styles that I think look more kind of similar a lot to what exists in Europe, but also like there's different styles that I find that predominate in the Northeast compared to other parts of the continent. Like I would say in the Southwest, in California, the Southwest, and like Florida, like when you look at like some of these historic manors, like say Hearst Castle or Vizcaya in Florida, or some of the others in Florida, like that, like the what is it, the Ringling Museum, the Flagler Estate, I think it is. A lot of these historic, like large scale mansions, like the ones that are now tourist attractions, they have like a more Spanish kind of influence to them down there. Whereas in the Northeast, the historic mansions don't have so much the Spanish influence, and I would say have more Northern European influences. Like when you look at, say, like Casa Loma, for instance, that's very influenced by like Northern European styles of castles. I would say the palatial estates in Newport, Rhode Island have a lot of like, I guess you could say kind of generic European influence, but it's like, it's not like a specifically like Spanish or Southern European influence to the extent of the mansions in like Florida or California. So I would say that would be kind of a bit of a distinguishing factor, like the lack of the Spanish influence on the historic architecture and more just like either British Isles influence or kind of like a generic Northern European or Pan-European type influence, as opposed to like anything that's like specifically Southern European. And you could say that for both these mansions, but also like other architecture in general. Like there's a lot of like, even for like the regular buildings in like New Orleans or Savannah, Charleston, there is a lot of like Southern European influence. So I would say, as I mentioned earlier, that would be another differentiating factor. So yeah, I guess that that addendum finally concludes this video. Thanks for watching.